Welcome to Season 4 of Under the Sisterhood, Women's March for Mental Wellness. This season, we're diving deep into the intersection of women's mental health and overall wellness, bringing you thought-provoking conversations every Friday. We'll explore a wide range of topics, including how mental health impacts every stage of a woman's life, the intricate connections between physical and emotional well-being, and the role of practitioners who champion mental wellness. This podcast celebrates women, their resilience, and the incredible contributions they make to our world. I'm Elizabeth Elfenbein. Let's get under the hood. Today, we're getting under the hood of Sabrina Sarro, a daughter, sister, friend, and a mixed-race Black, queer, trans psychotherapist specializing in chronic pain. As someone who also experiences chronic pelvic pain, she empathizes deeply with her patients. She has specialized training in EMDR and IFS and works with many clients experiencing embedded chronic recurrent UTIs, interstitial cystitis, vulvodynia, pelvic floor dysfunction, endometriosis, and PCOS. As the lead psychotherapist at Graymatters, a private mental health practice based in New York City, Sabrina is also a race, gender, and sexuality specialist working with BIPOC, LGBTQIA+, TGNC folks who are also experiencing chronic pelvic pain. In addition to working with clients, she also speaks on issues related to pelvic pain through blogs and podcasts, and as well as being highly involved in the pelvic pain online digital community. On top of all that, she is currently pursuing her doctorate focusing on communities of color and the medical industrial complex. Welcome, Sabrina.
Thank you so much for having me, Elizabeth. It's really a deep honor to be here, and I'm really excited to talk to you today.
Oh, wow. I couldn't be more thrilled. It's Women's March for Mental Wellness, and I think that all of what you're doing and what you've done, your journey is going to be very exciting to share with our audience. Let's go going.
Yes, let's dive right in.
Awesome. So I love this question. I ask every woman it, and it's so interesting to hear the diversity of answers. But, clearly we all start somewhere. What was that inflection point that got you into mental health and wellness?
The first thing that I think comes to my mind when I hear this question really rooted in inflection point, it brings me back to maybe 10, 11, 12 years old. During that time, I was noticing that my peers, many of them, were moving into their first menstrual cycles, were really excited to sort of move into this next stepping stone of girlhood in many ways, right? It was around this time that I was really starting to identify that something different was happening in my body and that I was not moving through the same things as they were. 10, 11, 12, 13, growing up, I was extremely upset and worried because I had not had a period. My period was not on time. It took me several years to get a first period. And around that time, I was also starting to notice what I have now recognized as hormonal symptoms back during that time. I was really, really overweight. It was really hard for me to lose weight at that time. I noticed that my peers, right, like we were all eating maybe similar foods, but it just seemed as though they were metabolizing the food a bit differently. I had terrible acne, and I know that that can be a familiar experience across many young folks, but I just had a deep gnawing feeling that something was really amiss here. I was constantly hungry, constantly hot, and my period was just pretty much irregular. 14, 15, 16, those years when I was in high school, really began my desperate attempt to be understood and listened to by doctors. It was around that time that I was going to multiple OBGYNs and multiple providers, trying to get them to listen to me and trying to get them to understand what was actually happening in my body. I had always grown up understanding that cycles can fluctuate. They can be contingent upon things like stress, diet, environmental triggers. But I knew as a baseline, I knew that I it was not appropriate for me to not be getting a period at least once a month. I would be missing periods every month, sometimes as much as 6 months to a year. Providers just kept shrugging me off, gaslighting me. That's were one of my first experiences of what medical gaslighting can look like, right? So there was a young child of color who was coming in with questions and, wanting to know explanations, wanting to understand why providers were so quick to tell me that everything was fine and my blood work looked fine and nothing needed to be done and it's okay to not get, your cycle. That's really the messaging that I was heard in a lot of ways, that I was told in a lot of ways. And so throughout this time, I think that was really my first inflection point, to be honest. It was my first up close and personal sparring and contending with the medical industrial complex as we know it today. And being a young person, spending a lot of time, spending a lot of resources that I didn't already have, spending a lot of mental energy trying to get folks to believe me and to affirm my experience. And it wouldn't be until 10 years later that I would get a diagnosis of PCOS and finally begin to start treatment. But all in those 10 years, my health was progressively deteriorating. What now became irregular periods soon metamorphosed into fatty liver disease, into all of these different things. Had I been taken seriously in the first place, had I had been given a platform to really express and to expand upon my worries that were very important to me and deeply personal to me, perhaps I would have had access to treatment much earlier. And so that was really my inflection point where I was deeply disturbed as a young person and very attuned to the way that I had to fight to get someone to listen to me. And this did not stop. This persisted for many years until I finally got the right diagnosis and was offered substantial medical treatment beyond birth control, right? Beyond the birth control pill, which is a common, first line treatment for a variety of hormonal conditions. And so that was my first inflection point where during high school, I was really thinking critically around, wow, I'm not being heard. I'm not being taken seriously, and my health feels like it's on the line. This feels like a high stakes experience. And why is it that people are not taking me seriously? What is actually happening in this cocktail of bedside manner plus cultural sustaining care plus culturally aware care? What is happening in this equation that is ultimately leaving me feeling like I have no answers? I'm no closer to an explanation that honors me. And all the while, I'm suffering. My mental health is suffering, and I'm losing my formative years, many of them, to the revolving door of doctors and doctors' visits. And so I think, yeah, that's really kind of where I would identify that first inflection point.
Thank you for saying the first inflection point. I want to say there is so much to unpack there. The
Yes.
mental health side of that, of not feeling seen and heard, has got to be like the weight of that has to be huge, separate of how you're feeling physically. I just wanted to acknowledge that, but I want you to go on your journey. So
Thank you.
really, as a young person, so intelligent. So talk about, I mean, because look at all that you've done in your life. So what happened next?
I started to notice 10 years, fast forward 10 years, right? I started to notice now another inflection point, right? Not only was I not getting answers just at a baseline growing up, right? But now I noticed that in order to have access to get closer to answers, I needed to seek care that was outside of my insurance network. And, to make this more understandable, right, to our audience members, I learned extraordinarily early on that if I was going to have any attempt to someone helping me translate the disarray that was happening in my body, that was going to come at an extraordinarily high cost, and that I was going to now have to seek medical concierge care outside of my network, right? And so this now became a second inflection point because not only was I exhausted and utterly burnt out from the first 10 years, right? So we're talking like 10 to 20 sorting through what's happening. I'm not menstruating properly. All of these other, secondary symptoms are accompanied by that. My blood work is starting to be off. Year by year, something would be alarming. No one was taking me seriously, right? And the mental health implications of that were starting to show. I was incredibly angry. I was getting frustrated. I was feeling traumatized by going to doctor's offices. I was anxious. And I think I was also just I was really enraged by the system at that point. And so, yeah, and I just was like, going in network is useless for me at this point. No one's going to help me here. I have to sort of now work extra jobs. I was always working numerous jobs in undergrad and graduate school. And that was my first time really going outside of the network. Right. And so what does that mean? It means that you're paying out of pocket for a provider's fee that is likely not going to get reimbursed by your in-network insurance unless you happen to have out-of-network coverage or benefits. And it was until that moment where I started to be taken seriously and then started to be, medically treated for PCOS. And I will say, even at that time, the medical treatments available were far and few in between, right? I think we're now starting to see in 2025, we're now starting to understand the breadth of medications that can help really what is a metabolic disorder, PCOS, right? But at that time, I was spent. I literally, all my money was going to doctors, all of the money that I had managed to save from working at a diner, from working here, from tutoring part-time, any hustle that I managed to find, all of that money went to paying providers' fees. Around that time in college, it was very clear to me early on that I was meant to be a provider. It was very evident to me early on that my ministry on the planet was going to be to advocate for people, to walk alongside them, to help them utilize and harness their own voice, their own intuition, their own power, to help embolden them in that direction. But it was very clear that my job was going to be to steward and sort of shepherd folks feeling like they can utilize their voice and not giving up on themselves, really, in a medical system that is just as confusing, right? It's a maze of claims, deductibles, copays, coinsurance, this, that, right? Like it's designed so that we are labored by it. And that was one of my first kind of moments too, where I was like, okay, yeah, I think I'm definitely going to be a social worker. I want to be a Black social worker. I want to be somebody who is giving back to this field that has been founded upon my ancestors, right? Ancestors of color, queer folks, indigenous folks, folks of the people for the people. And so social work to me is extremely distinct of a discipline, right? It's not the same as mental health counseling. It's not the same as any other broad form of counseling, but it's social work, right? And lots of lineages that follow when we talk about that field. And so, yeah, right after my undergrad, I went straight to social work school. And I knew that I wanted to be working in advanced clinical practice, so one-on-one work. And I really wanted to be I wanted to redevelop a new model of care for people that I was working with. And I wanted to debunk archaic old models that I didn't think were serving folks. Because to me, therapy is highly, highly intimate and it's a relationship. It's a relationship, and it's deep witness work. Out of all of the medical, models of care, to me, therapy is one that has the potential to actually impact people the most, more than any other field of medicine.
I love that. I'm just like in awe of just the experience. First of all, the fact that you experienced and witnessed your own experience, like deeply and profoundly, that you decided to, call it pay it forward. Like you
Hmm.
had this experience. How do you go in and fix a broken system? And we know it's very hard to
Very
address
hard.
on a systemic level. However, if you can go in and have that impact on a one-to-one level, it can be very profound. And I think what's interesting to me, Sabrina, is the way you do it. Did you
Hmm.
the word witness and really that ultimate care model where you're in it with them and the relationship one has with their therapist?
Yes.
So intimate and personal. But I think when we think about it, sometimes we're so in the one-on-one that we don't realize that just like your journey has had deep impact on now the work you're doing,
Right.
you are in that space sharing and witnessing that person on
Exactly.
the other side, the ability to have the ripple effect because you're
Exactly.
touching so many more lives of your own
Mhm.
experience. And so
Thank you.
it's remarkable that you've taken a challenging journey and really put it to good use. And I love the social work. My mom was a social worker. So
Ah,
I
lovely.
love I love the way you're looking at it. I want you to talk a little bit about, because you commented about being a Black, talk
Yeah.
about why you think of it through that lens or
Yes.
communicated it that way.
I think that we cannot exist in the world without paying deep attention to the way that intersectional isms, right? Whether that's racism, classism, sexism, right? We cannot actually move through the world without understanding how these systems of violence, right, speak back to one another, right? We cannot actually do ethical work without pausing right there and acknowledging positionality, power, privilege, and the way that all of those things inform how we get access to care in the world, how we get access to attention, how we get access to anything, any space, right? And so, you know, I mentioned that because as a young person, it was not lost on me that I do believe that a number of these providers reduced me to an angry Black child or an angry child of color, right? It's not lost on me that I was quick to be pathologized as maybe somebody who was ruminating or hyperfixating on medical systems or, medical experiences rather, or my symptoms, right? Like, it's not lost on me that perhaps if I did indeed have a provider of color, even, which I did not for a very long time growing up, right? That perhaps I would have had a different experience being believed with regards to my symptoms, right? And so I mentioned blackness because there is no part of my life that blackness does not touch or inform. There is no part of my identity as a human being on the planet that does not speak back to being Black or being a person of color, right? And those are not interchangeable, right? I also specifically name Black because of the violence and the history of systemic harm that Black folks have had to endure at the face of white supremacy in this country, right? And so it's not lost on me that whenever we're talking about the medical industrial complex, we are also talking about Black people whose bodies were used without anesthesia, whose bodies were used without their consent, right? I think of people like Henrietta Lacks. I think of all of the Black bodies that were experimented on, used as vehicles to gather data, right, without their autonomy, agency, or consent, right? And so, all of that to say, I think it's really important to talk about anti-Black racism in the medical system because many of us, first off, many Black folks, number one, don't have access to the type of providers that we would even need to see to get accurate diagnoses. Many of us, right, are trapped by in-network access, are either on Medicaid or either have really low coverage options, right? And a lot of us cannot afford to pay the thousands of dollars that we now see, even in 2025, are being at like mo a lot of providers are not in network any longer, right? Including myself. I don't take insurance where I work, right? And so I understand this larger conversation of insurance also being broken, providers needing to get paid what they're worth. I pay deep respect to that. And it's still recycling and perpetuating a system here of lack of access, lack of community members being seen thoughtfully and carefully.
You said at what, 9, 10, you're going to the doctors, you had questions, you weren't being answered.
No.
I think women in general have a problem, but then I think the subsection of Black women, I couldn't agree more with everything
Yes.
you're saying. The system is so multi-layered in its complexity, and it's almost designed for you not to figure it out, that it goes deeper than that. So it does
Yes.
touch more, but it goes deeper. And I think that I don't want you to, like, I want to pay homage to everything you're saying, because
Thank you.
say it with such sensitivity and clarity and
Hmm.
conviction. So I'm kind of curious. So you go off to school, you do your master's in social work. I know that in your introduction, you're doing your doctorate. Talk about
Yeah.
how you got in, you became a psychotherapist from social work.
Yes.
Talk a little bit
Yes.
about that experience, and as you journeyed on, how you went
Yeah.
from one thing to the next.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I believe that we are all storied beings, and I believe deeply in the transformative power of narrative and holding and centering narrative, And so therapy undoubtedly speaks back to that. I also grew up as a writer, so I was pretty involved in literary spaces. After my master's in social work, I did actually end up getting an MFA in New York City. So I spent some time, delving into nonfiction, which is what I concentrated in my MFA program, and just the power of story, the power of what happens in all of us when we are exposed to a piece of art that is evoking something in us, right? And we can all, I think, all of us on the planet have moments where we're either looking at wonderful acting or we're reading something that really strikes something in us or whatever it may be. We're looking at a piece of art, we're looking at something. It was that I think was a light bulb moment for me. And I was like, oh, I love narrative. I love story. But beyond that, I love what words, language, and narrative does. I love what it can do for the human experience. I love how it unveils us, it unearths us, it forces us to unmask in the presence of other humanity, right? I think of James Baldwin, right, who has a quote that goes like, you think that you're alone or that your problems are unprecedented in the world, but then you pick up a book and read and you realize that's not the case, right? So he has a quote that kind of speaks to that a little bit. And so one-on-one direct therapy to me felt like the best bridge of those two worlds, right? It felt like a place where I could have the capacity and the privilege to go back in time with somebody and to help them synthesize all of that data into what was showing up, inside of them today and how they wanted to take that information or data and move forward, right? And so to me, it felt like the perfect braiding of my love of narrative, my love of writing, my love of arc, escalating tension, plot, character development, right? All of that functions in a human life. There's no human being on the planet who doesn't have a plot of some kind, right? Some arc of conflict. None of us are immune to conflict, right? And so to me, therapy feels like I can actually write stories in real time with people. I can transfer that from the page to real time, and I'm quite literally helping people assemble and disassemble the storyboards of their life. And to me, that is memoiring, right? I'm a memoirist and I write on the page, but I'm also memoiring every day with people, every week, in helping them to deconstruct the story of who they are, right? And so to me, there was no better marriage of loves than therapy and writing and really infusing both in my career. And so, as a therapist for wow, almost 10 years now, practicing, doing one-on-one therapy, which is wild to say. I started out in, wow, I graduated in 2018, right? And so that summer after I graduated, I was immediately seeing folks. So almost 10 years. It felt like the perfect blend of gifts that I wanted to really utilize and be centered with folks, right? And what is therapy that beyond that, right? Yes, you are helping people with skills. You're using evidence-based modalities. You're using diagnosis maybe to help frame or make sense of something. Sure, you're doing all of those things, but what is that but not storyboarding? What is that but not storytelling, right? What is that beyond making elements and giving them back as a story that honors the individual, and honors where they want to go?
I think it's interesting as a therapist.
Hmm.
Love you use the word story and storied. And I
Yes.
and
Yeah.
there is a
It's different.
distinction in both. But I want to
Yes.
call attention to the fact that, I love the fact that that you're passionate about using the blend. But
Yes.
going into therapy and hearing people's stories and helping
Yes.
figure out their story,
Yes.
it's interesting, and the impact you can have on that journey as they are shaping the
Yes.
current narrative, going from their past to their future to who they are today.
Yes.
So past
Yes.
today, and then what does that look like 10 years from now? Not that we're supposed to be living in the future. We're
No, I know.
what I'm saying,
Yeah.
I really want to stay in the
Right.
present. What intrigues me about all of this is the heaviness, the weight of like shaping a story around, you don't go into therapy because you're sitting in the positive side of life and it's all about that. It's because you're trying to expose and uncover all
Sure.
the challenges and things that are
Sure.
roadblocks, if you will. So
Sure.
little bit about that because I
Yeah.
love the way you framed this. But as a
Yeah.
therapist, getting into the psychology of it. And I also want to make one other distinction as well. I love
Sure.
the way you said, yeah, we have to do all these modalities. And we spoke to your EMDR, all the
Yes.
modalities
Yes.
have to sit in here with the,
Yeah.
evidence-based care. Talk about that because that
Yeah. So that's really, no, great question, right? And so I think, therapy is distinct in that when I hear the question around the psychology of therapy or the psychology of this work, right? What makes it effective? What makes it work, right? Well, the first question of what happened to you comes to mind, right? I think there's a lot, or what is happening to you now? What's happening inside of you, right? And so I think the psychology of a lot of this is rooted in, well, therapy has the unique ability to take us back. Most disciplines, most spaces are present facing, present thinking, right? You go to the doctor, sure, you give them a little bit of medical history and all of that, but this is the one space that I can really think of where you have a deep, deep, intimate opportunity to actually have a facilitator who's been trained to walk you through gaps, memories, to walk you through the story of past you as well. And I think psychology is really, psychology, sure, but when I think of social work, which is what I've been trained in, right? Social work is also the very intimate work of utilizing all of your identities, all of the environmental factors that have informed where you've arrived at today, using that to also locate and understand and unpack how what has happened to you might still be showing up today, right? And so, as providers in social work, right, as people who graduate and then go on to work as licensed clinical social workers or whatever it might be, right? Clinical. I think of that word clinical and I think of that word, right? Like, okay, what is the presentation of all of these stories? What has this storied human being in front of me? What's happening now, right? What are the symptoms that we're noticing? How are they presenting? What is showing up? What is a roadblock? What's a racket? What's positively affecting them, right? Like, I think in no other discipline do you have access to actually widespread going back in time and really picking apart and unpacking pieces of the lifespan like you are in psychotherapy. And yes, the importance of evidence-based modalities is evident, right? You need to be applying, right, modalities that offer structure, that offer homage to neuroscience, right? We talk so much about trauma. We talk about what trauma can be. It's a word that we are seeing used more and more often in spaces, social media, TikTok, all of these spaces, right? And so I think the psychology behind this is that in no other discipline do you have access to a mental health provider who can really be instrumental in helping you make sense of things that have happened before you and how those things that have happened before you or happened in your past might still be showing up today, right? We think of like psychoanalytical work, the shadow of our behaviors, right? What is actually happening and what's the story we're making about all of it, you know? And so to me, when I think of the field, yes, it's beyond stories. It's also about merging stories plus treatment, diagnosis, supporting folks across all iterations of symptomology or presentation, right? It also involves a deeply nuanced approach to care and what care looks like in every different, in every body, right? In different communities. Care is defined differently. It looks like a different thing. It's a different vehicle depending on who you are talking to. Social work is also so much more than the one-on-one 45-minute a week interaction that you might be getting, right? It's also about, it also involves case management. It also involves macro fields. It also involves, right, person in their environment, learning. Like it spans so much. But to me, it's a unique opportunity to really get to access the full person, which I think a lot of other disciplines unfortunately eclipse. And you don't get to access that full person in the same way.
So you guys get to see sort of the holistic view of
Yeah.
person.
Yes.
I'm putting my hands together, audience, as person is at the center, the core, and the
Yes.
circle gets bigger and bigger
It's
and
bigger.
community. And I think
Yes.
that you hit on some things, which is like, trauma is a big thing today. We're living trauma. I just can't even
We're living trauma. Yeah.
trauma. Are you doing like, do you find a lot of the work you're doing with clients addressing like current trauma, but also intergenerational trauma? I hear a lot of that, the
Yeah.
intergenerational trauma. But then,
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'd love for you to talk a little bit about trauma across
Yeah.
generations, across
Yes.
cultures, and across
Yes.
systems, and then,
Yes.
and then topical, if you will. So when I say cultural, it's literal culturals versus cultural
Yep.
trends, which is
Yeah.
topical, so.
Topical. Yep.
Mm.
I love that people have already brought up intergenerational trauma. Absolutely. We have evidence. We know that trauma can be passed in utero. We know that trauma is often something that we inherit, we pass down, we see that trauma continues its legacy generationally. That is no secret to many of us, right? And so, to answer your first question, yes, I am always targeting intergenerational trauma with my clients. I can't think of a scenario in which I'm processing trauma with somebody and that doesn't come up, right? So, we are always making a container and just stepping back and really seeing and analyzing. Well, yeah, like this pattern that you're noticing, where has that pattern also been familiar? Where have you seen that pattern? And a lot of people will say, well, my mother struggles with the same thing, and perhaps her mother before that struggled with the same thing, right? Or oh, I've always come from a generation of people where boundary setting has been particularly hard, right? Or whatever the case may be, right? And so I think we see very, very early on the intergenerational impact that trauma can have. And then to more broadly speak to your question about how, as a social worker, I talk about trauma or hold trauma cross-culturally or topically. Yeah, I'm talking about trauma every day of my life with clients. There's no day actually that I'm living through where I'm not talking about the trauma that most of my clients are enduring at the hands of this new regime that we're under, right? There's no sort of space where trauma is not being discussed, right? Acute trauma, chronic trauma, trauma intergenerationally, right? There is no space in my life where I don't hear a client talking to me about the trauma of being afraid that they are no longer going to get HIV medicine, the trauma of seeing people die from measles when we have a cure for that, when we have a vaccine for that, right? The trauma of the Department of Education being threatened, right, to collapse under this regime, right? But also the trauma of people living now in this dictatorship where their identities are being erased, their lives are under direct threat, their loved ones are being deported, right? There's so much that is happening that I couldn't even tell you what's not trauma anymore. Every single person that I meet with is scared for their life. And me too, right? Like I think we're all in this collective burrowing of how do I protect myself? What move do I make next? Do I stay in this country? Do I leave? What happens to me now? Every moment is another headline that can reactivate trauma. Every day I wake up and there's another headline of trauma, right? Whether it's Haiti being a shithole country, my family is from Haiti, right? Whether it's whatever it is, right? I think that there's so much more than ever now that we have access to. Um, and our nervous systems are constantly being upregulated in the face of anxiety, trauma, worry, and the fear of death, imminent death, right? And so, when I think about topical trauma or when I think about how trauma looks differently amongst cultures, right? The first thing that I am brought to is that conversation or kind of what I was talking about a little bit earlier around positionality in the planet and positionality in the world, right? Like I think at a baseline, most of us are experiencing vicarious secondhand trauma from all of this, right? Like I can confidently say that. But then when you start to dissect this on a micro level and you're taking individuals, right? Individuals who are coming from different spaces, right? Dark-skinned Black individuals, trans individuals, individuals who are worried about maintaining their status in this country, whatever it is, right? Then I think we start entering into more nuanced conversations and dialogues around trauma on a molecular level for these folks, right? And so, you know,
Mm.
I can work with somebody who can share with me that everything that's happening right now is a nightmare. We can't even believe that it's 2025 and this is here. These things are happening. Like I could talk to a client who can share those things with me, but their day to day might not be affected from a trauma perspective, right? Around or in regards to or as a result of these larger things that are happening in the world. But then I could work with somebody else who is absolutely in the center, in the thickness of this threat, this violence, and that trauma will look extraordinarily different, right? That trauma will then look like all number of things, right? It could look like suicidality. It could look like anything. It could look like, Sabrina, there's no point to go forward because everywhere I go, I am being told I don't matter. I am being told that whatever it is, right? I'm being told XYZ about my people, where I come from, who I am. And so I think that's where what I said earlier about how we cannot actually be in this work ethically if we are not talking about how all of these constructs of violence are being wielded and used to kill, to erase people, and to ultimately enact and recycle patterns of harm that we are all familiar with historically. These are the same genocides that we're seeing be recycled. It's the same thing, actually. Every year you see it manifest in a different way, but it's actually no different from what this country was built upon. I think we can all turn our attention towards what's happening and empathize with that and share whatever it might be. But then I think individually, I'm meeting with folks who actually are not safe where they live, right? They have no foundation at all because their direct safety is under attack and under threat. And so when we think about trauma topically or trauma cross-culturally, yes. My answer is yes. Culture, race, gender, access to class, money, wealth, all of it impacts trauma. All of it also impacts the way we treat trauma. All of it also impacts the way that we might discuss trauma showing up in the body, right? And that's where really wonderful modalities like EMDR can come in, right? Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, bilateral eye stimulation, right? All of these trauma modalities, most of them are really rooted and designed to help downregulate the central nervous system and to try and really remind the nervous system that it can remain neutral and that it can be safe again,
Mm.
right? So much of trauma is that remembered cellular memory of I'm not safe. even if a person were to be in an environment that wasn't actively a threat to them, trauma makes it very hard to distinguish those moments. It's very hard to actually distinguish, yeah, I'm okay right now versus the 5 years of abuse that have been locked into my memory. You know what I mean? And so right now, more than ever, people are talking about what's happening. Right now, more than ever, people are afraid. Right now, more than ever, we're seeing a traumatized state of people who are doing everything that they can to see to, just to see to it that they wake up the next day. And that's all that they can manage right now.
How do you take on the trauma? How do you filter the stories in such a way that at the end of the day, you can have some amount of central nervous system peace? If you,
I do my best to really unplug when it's time to unplug, right? Just speaking back to what you shared about boundaries, I think it's so easy in this work to experience transference, right? Or to experience countertransference, right? Or to experience moments where we feel like we're paralleling our patients' lives. And most of us are actually in some ways, you know what I mean? Not always, but many of us can really deeply understand and empathize with what our clients are saying when they say that they're afraid for their family. They're afraid for their family members. They're afraid for anything, right? Most of us can really deeply go there and we've been there, but I think the hallmark of boundaries in this work is in order to be effective at what I do as a provider, I cannot take it on. I have to purposefully unenmesh, right? I have to really be diligent and vigilant about unplugging and making sure that I can pour into me so that I can show up as the container that I want to be for my patients, right? And so I think, I exercise a lot. I do my best to be around community that honors me and uplifts me. Um, I do my best to not be on the clock when it's time to be off. I do my best to really remind myself that I am also a storied being away from this work. I am a therapist, but also my life has not been reduced to just providing therapy. There's a number of things that I care about, that I want to do, that I want to explore beyond my patient's trauma and my own trauma. And I think that that 20% that I give myself helps me undoubtedly to ensure that I'm giving 100% of me in the work, right? And I think therapy is a really distinct practice, right? Every day you are talking, every day you are in the middle of the most direct interpersonal connection that you can get. You're having conversations with folks every day, and you are simulating to their nervous systems what healthy relationships can look like. The
mm,
therapeutic relationship is one of the most important relationships because it actually provides clients and patients a unique opportunity to process conflict, to process boundaries, to process that in the container, And so where they might not have ever had access or spaces to practice that before.
yeah.
And so I do my best to take care of myself. I do my best to find joy, to laugh, to not let this world take any more of my joy that I'm entitled to, right? I try to really, claim that for myself as much as I can. But I think beyond that, this is also community work that we're doing.
Yeah.
I'm working with folks individually, but I'm also working in communities. I'm working with folks individually, but most of my patients are in my community as well.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I was going to ask you the question of how you mark for mental wellness, and you might want to add a little more to that. But I think
Yeah.
it sounds like really you understand what you need to do, and without your cup being full, you can't
Oh.
give. And I think it's interesting as well because being a therapist, to your point, you're talking, but you're not talking like it's intentional talk, which requires a great deal of energy. So how do you march for mental wellness? If there's anything else you want to add?
The one thing I can say is that I never give up on my patients. I work tirelessly alongside them to help them arrive at places that are deeply distinct and different from where they first came in. And one thing about me is that I refuse to believe that my patients can't get better. I refuse to believe that there's not some way we can access XYZ together. And I rally. I rally and I advocate and I go there. I go in it So, my best advice in thinking about marching is do not give up. There are providers out there who are deeply waiting for you, just as you might be deeply waiting for them. Do not give up. Do not be afraid to ask for what you need. There are providers out there who will be helping you to the bones in getting you what you need and who will not stop listening. Each time I go into the session, I'm listening again. I'm activating my own curiosity about what's happening because I don't ever want to get complacent or comfortable. I want to keep going in and making sure things are dynamic. We're not stagnant beings. We are constantly changing, and so too can our symptoms change. And so, one thing that I share an offering is the biggest fight in your life will be the fight of protecting yourself and those that you love. That will be the biggest thing that you can do. Our time on the planet is long, but it's also short. It's both short and long, is what I believe. It can feel really long when we are in the middle of violence, and it can also feel really short when we're in the middle of violence, And so I think the best fight and the most rewarding fight is the fight of protecting ourselves, and doing that in community and doing that in a way that honors who we are, and especially in the face of a world and government that is happy to erase many of us and is encouraging that actually.
I'm going to close out this with a question because I think it's actually the perfect timing with that message you just gave, which is, this is your platform to give a message to women of all ages, of all backgrounds, of all cultures. What do you want to leave them with, Sabrina?
I want to leave you with you are worth fighting for. You are worth fighting for. If there's ever an environment, space, provider that leaves you feeling like you're not, move swiftly and pivot. You are worth fighting for. This life is not done. You are worth it. Do not give up on yourself. Do not give up on fighting for all that you deserve and all that you are entitled to receive as a human being on this planet. And that's what I would leave folks with.
I mean, what a beautiful message. You are worth it. Sabrina, thank you so
Thank you
much.
so much,
It was
Elizabeth.
wonderful to get under the hood with you. So thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. It was wonderful to be here. I'm honored to be here.
Thanks for listening to Under the Sisterhood. If you haven't already, please give us a quick rating and review on Apple or Spotify. And make sure to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn so you can hear from more amazing women. This podcast is created and hosted by Under the Sisterhood LLC and Elizabeth Elfenbein, produced by Elizabeth Elfenbein and Matt Butler, and edited by Matt Butler. The music is by Ayla Schaefer. Her song, Rose.